Hey everyone, Jason here. So today we're going to get started doing the fiberglass and epoxy on the inner hull. Now our first step is going to be to add an epoxy fillet down all the seams within the hull. Okay, now that's going to add a lot of structural stability, and it's also going to do a final fill of any gaps that we might have, especially where the stitches went through. Okay, so now if you're not familiar with what a fillet is, basically we're going to thicken up some epoxy with some wood flour, and if you've purchased a kit from Cheasapeake Light Craft, they've included some pre-made wood flour in the kit. Okay, so we're going to start mixing up our thickened epoxy with the wood flour. Now we're going to need to mix up a fair amount, but especially if it's really warm outside or if you're in a hot climate, you don't want to mix up too much because you're going to be working with two variables here. The one is that epoxy kicks off a lot quicker in warm temperatures, but also it'll kick off a lot faster when it's got a larger volume. So later on, when we start to apply the epoxy to our cloth, you'll see that I might pour the epoxy out so that I can just spread it out, and that's to avoid it kicking off in the cup. In this case, we can't really do that because we're going to have a thickened mass. So I'd say aim for about a cup worth of thickened epoxy right now, and go from there. But pay attention to how it feels in your hand as you're working, and everything should work out. Once you have a reasonable amount of epoxy in your mixing cup, start by stirring it up. You want to make sure that the epoxy in the cup is stirred really well before you add your wood flour. So I'm going to recommend that you stir it for a good 2 minutes first. Now once your epoxy, resin, and hardener have been mixed up, we can start adding wood flour. Add it relatively slowly and mix it in. And what we're going for is basically a peanut butter type consistency. So now with my thickened epoxy all mixed up, I'm going to add it to a large freezer bag. I'm going to push it all down into one corner and then just snip off a small corner from the edge. As we're adding our thickened epoxy, we want it to be a relatively thick bead. We're going to fillet it out with an epoxy tool later on. Okay, so we finished off filleting the inner hull, and we're going to move directly now into laying out some fiberglass. So the benefit of doing the fiberglass cloth at the same time is that our fillets are still going to be soft, and so when we lay up our fiberglass cloth, we're going to saturate it in, and we're going to get a much smoother finish, but also we're going to end up getting a chemical bond between the fillet epoxy and the epoxy used to lay up the cloth. Okay, if we waited and the fillets were completely cured, then we'd get a mechanical bond, all right? And a chemical bond is always going to be stronger. So the first thing we're going to do is lay out a piece of fiberglass cloth to cover the entire cockpit. After that, we're going to cut lengths of fiberglass tape to cover the interior fillets. Again, we're going to mix up some epoxy resin and hardener. This time we're not going to use any fillers. I'm going to emphasize again that we want to make sure that our epoxy is thoroughly mixed. We definitely don't want to go back and have to peel off fiberglass and wash off sticky uncured epoxy. So take the time and mix the epoxy for at least 2 minutes. If you're worried about your epoxy kicking off too soon, then just mix smaller batches. From here, we're going to brush thickened epoxy onto the tape. We're going to use a disposable bristle brush, and again, I've trimmed the bristles back about half the length so that it's easier to work with. Try to get enough epoxy on the tape to thoroughly wet it out. We want the tape to be clear, but not so much that it pools or causes the tape to float. In the cockpit, do the same. Saturate the fabric with unthickened epoxy. You can use a brush or a clean plastic spreader. Once you have the fiberglass cloth inside the cockpit fully saturated, you can use a squeegee to move excess epoxy onto the plywood of the bulkheads to seal the interior of the hull. Now, once the epoxy of the interior is cured, apply a second thin coat over the interior of the weave. Once the interior epoxy is cured, apply a second thin coat over the interior to fill the weave of the fiberglass and give you extra strength. Alright, so I've got all the fiberglass cloth saturated with the epoxy. Now I'm just going over the cloth with the squeegee and just removing any of the excess epoxy. So the next step, I'm just going to go over all of the plywood and just give it a light coat of epoxy, and then that'll be it for the day.